Oh, welcome. Hello everybody. Psychosocial classes. Both of you guys, what's going on? And I wanted to do a kind of a check-in, kind of a review of our violence and abuse section. I want to kind of review some of the things that I read on the discussion board, the fabulous conversations you guys were having. Kind of made me miss in class, wanting, kind of longing to have these conversations with you guys in person. But I think you guys have done an excellent job at back and forth learning from each other. Seen a lot more interactions rather than kind of the minimum posts, and I really appreciate that. Seen some good evidence being used and analyzed as well, and so I want to kind of give credit to some of that. It's kind of an update. We're going to start the this week. We're going to start the violence and suicide section, and I'll do a lecture on that as well. To sort of talk about my own experience. I know that this is going to overlap with mental health, and the way that I justify that is because suicide is so important and it's so prevalent, even to the point where they're saying us as nurses have to have uh, extra hours of education to renew our license. So my focus isn't going to be necessarily on the nursing interventions that you're going to see or have when you see somebody who's suicidal, but really talk about the background and theory on suicidality. Kind of why people are suicidal and what are some misconceptions there that I think might be a little bit more deeper than you would go into the care of the mental health patient class. I don't remember what the number is now. We've changed them. So we're gonna watch a movie in class. We're gonna have our first in class experience next week. I'm gonna do it on Monday, the 11th. We'll do our class times, which I believe are 12:30 and 2. I'll send the link out to everyone, so you can either do 12:30 or 2. We're gonna be watching The Listeners. Just a fabulous movie on an hour-long movie on people who assess who are the crisis phone call for people who are suicidal. I'm going to use a watching party is going to be an experiment. If it doesn't end up working out, we'll figure it out. I think it'll be fine. It works on browser and it works on phone. I haven't tried it on Apple devices, but I think it'll work all right. So I'll sort of live stream it and I'll send you guys a link out just before. So look at your emails next week before 12:30 or 1. There's going to be a worksheet on it that you'll only be able to do the worksheet if you watch it. So you won't be able to. Some of my questions I know are open ended. You can kind of get through them even if you haven't done the reading. But this is not the exam because I asked for specifics from the movie, and so you'll have to watch it to get the worksheet done. I know that as we do online, I'm sure a lot of you guys are working and stuff. So if those times don't work, you can rent the movie. I'll put a link on it. It's $6 the rent. I'll also put the link on the watching party that I do. So in case you can't make it and a couple of your friends can't, maybe you can host your own watching party and then you can split the $6 up between you. I don't know. And then we're gonna do the same thing with a movie, Captain Fantastic, in like 3 weeks, 4 weeks. I think we'll do it on a Tuesday because of the holiday on Monday. That one, however, is free on YouTube. You can watch it for free on YouTube, but it's like weird. They have to like edit out stuff to make it not copyright infringement. But it's been on there for like 11 months, and so it's probably free to watch. I'll do a live viewing party on that as well. It's a fabulous movie. If you have to rent it, or I recommend buying it. It's so good. Okay. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about the kind of as a final recap, and I know I didn't do really a lecture for this, and so kind of as a lecture and a recap of violence and abuse. It was probably worth listening to this whole video as I might be dropping things that I think are personally important, and if I find them to be personally important, I might end up somewhere. I don't know, on a quiz or something like that. I'm not sure. So, discussion board one, one of the topics, and I remember a couple cohorts ago, they're like, Nick, did you read the discussion boards on spanking? It blew up, and I was like, oh, I guess that I didn't think about how that might be a better in-class conversation than online conversation. But you guys are all very respectful, and that was fabulous. Um, and I think that it's probably one of those opinions where people on one end of it feel really strongly for it. A lot of people feel really strongly against it. Most of us tend to be in the middle of somewhere. Not saying that any of it is wrong, but it could be such a visceral experience when your opinion, when something like this, that's like spanking, you can feel really strongly about it, and that's great. That means you're passionate, and that's fabulous. We should all have these visceral opinions about something, not always about spanking, but something. But what is important to know is that it's still a bias, right? The more strongly we feel about it, the more biased and maybe unobjective we can be about it. And as nurses, we're going to be working with everybody, right? And so it's really important to be aware of your biases. Not that your biases in your opinion don't matter, not that it's not important, but the fact that you're aware of it. If you're absolutely 100% think spanking is wrong, right? If that is your opinion, that is your opinion to have, right? And I'm not trying to argue against it. But if you need to realize that biases when you work with your patients, right? Because if you have a patient who may feel differently, right? And you don't allow your biases to potentially affect the way you act and treat them. You kind of see where I'm going with that. But being aware of your biases can allow you to do that. I interact with people all the time where I completely, wholeheartedly disagree with the way that they live their life and treat people around them. But I've done it so much that I'm able to not let it affect the way I interact with them. It's my opinion. Maybe my goal of interactions is to help move in the right direction. Maybe you can gently educate people, but it's important to be aware of our biases as they might affect the way we do things. It will absolutely affect the way you interact with people if you have unchecked biases. So that's just something that I wanted to bring up. I loved one person brought up the studies done on spanking. Even a couple people I commented and said, hey, if you're going to mention research, drop it. Let's look at it. And one person kind of looked at research on both sides, not in a huge way, but a couple articles, and it's the way that you can study spanking is I think the only way you could do it is retroactive, right? You have data, right? Maybe you've surveyed people, that could be more perspective, but you can find almost anything retrospectively. You can go back and look at insurance databases and find whatever cause or correlation you want, right? A great example is that there's this article, and I don't remember the specifics, so it's gonna be really vague, but they found a certain intervention, a certain group of people were at risk of a heart disease or something like that, and it was very causative. It was very clear. But the publisher of the company says, we want you to go back and look at the data and pull out all of this demographics and find out, like, okay, so white guys who are 40 are at higher risk than this population. To say, no, retrospective, you're going to find whatever you want. Like, there's no reason to think that data is going to be accurate. And they insisted. So what they did is they went back to this group of people and they broke them up based off horoscope sign. And what they found is, okay, so most people are at high risk for this, but there's two horoscope signs that actually had less risk, which doesn't make any sense. And they insisted on publishing it. So it's a great example about how you can really find whatever you want to retrospectively. If you go back to a database of people who are violent abusers and you want to find out that spanking happened in 90% of them, that's going to be your causation. You're going to find that. And so really the best way is to do perspective, forward, interventional trials, which with spanking is probably not going to be appropriate. So I don't know if that data will ever happen. So I thought that was a great discussion piece. I think if I'm going to bring up my own opinion, which may or may not be value, I think spanking probably what's hard about it is that it's hard to do it not in a reactive way. It's hard for a parent to say, okay, you're in trouble. Your consequences of spanking and keep it emotionless that way. It's very difficult to do it, and spanking tends to be this reactive event where the parent is frustrated and it probably isn't particularly useful. We know that the discipline like that is not particularly useful. So that's probably my own opinion. It's like I said, it's not gray, it's not black or white, it's not good or bad in my opinion. Everything is gray and messy. But what I appeal to you guys is know your biases. And so that kind of brings us into sort of abuse. Okay, so what if you have somebody who comes in to the ER and you start noticing ideas of abuse? What's the first thing you're going to do? I'll tell you the answer. The answer is what they're there for, right? Do not neglect the reason they're in the ER to start addressing the abuse, right? If they're in there because they broke their leg, they have a heart attack, right? If whatever the reason, their chief complaint is, do not ignore their chief complaint to address the abuse. You have to address the abuse. But you do not divert whatever it is. You got to address the reason they're there. Does that make sense? Never ignore the chief complaint. That is always the first thing you do. Second thing you do is assess. You guys got that in the discussion board. Assess, do a full assessment. The elderly person with these symptoms that could be abuse, you could go in there and say, oh my gosh, who's abusing this poor person? Do an assessment and you probably will find really useful information there. Okay. Assessment is absolutely what you do next. Okay, so now you've assessed, okay, and this next part may come in at any point during it. They have a partner, and somebody brought this up wonderfully when someone comes in to the doctor or the ER or whatever, signs that there's abuse, lack of eye contact, the person they're there with is speaking for them, that kind of that dependent situation, okay, so what do? You got to get rid of the partner. That's very difficult to do, but the assessment probably has to happen alone, or at least part of the assessment has to happen alone. You got to find a reason to get rid of the apartment. If it's a female versus male, no, that's the way I'm going to say it. If it's a domestic violence where the perpetrator is a male and the victim is a female, where the supposed victim is a female, and you're a female nurse or a female healthcare provider, you kind of have it out there and saying that the next part is going to be gender specific. Please step out. If they're not gonna let you do it. It's not gonna be easy. They're not gonna say, oh, okay, thank you. If they're abusing this person, or if this is like a human trafficking situation, they're not gonna be like, okay, bye. They're gonna do everything they can to sit there. So not only you're gonna have to insist, you might have to insist with security, right? It's not gonna be easy. It's not gonna be easy at all. You're gonna have to insist, and you might have to insist with security. You got to get the person by themselves. What happens if you get them by themselves and they're mad about it, right? It happens, right? But you know that you had to do it. It's the probably the person who's hurting, right? The perpetrator is gonna make you feel weird about it. It's probably gonna gaslight you a little bit. And I've had this happen before where I feel weird afterwards because he's good at it, or they're good at it. It doesn't always be a he. They know how to mess with you in your head, and you're gonna be like, can you please step out of the room? We got to do this thing. But the person's on their own, gender specific. He's gonna start messing with your head, and you're gonna get mad, and then he's gonna mess with you. It's gonna be messy. It's never anything you're going to get used to, but it's definitely worth it for the perpetrator. And here's the other deal about that. Not for the perpetrator, it's worth it for the victim. But here's the deal about that is you're never going to be on your own, right? You're always going to have somebody. Go to your supervisor, get your nurse manager, get some help, right? Get somebody in there to back you up. And don't try to do this on one-man army, right? We're a team. And so that's what I want to encourage you. You can always call someone to help you out in those situations. If this is a first time and you suspect it, get help with it. Don't face it all by yourself. Okay. But you got to get the guy, you got to get the person who's speaking for them out of the room. You got to get the person by themselves. But then here's the next part, right? Is they do not have to disclose the abuse, right? They do not have to. I'm trying to think of if people brought up, a lot of people brought up resources about how to therapeutic approach it. And some people just said validating their feelings. That's fabulous. That's excellent. But you do not have to. And I know that in the human trafficking article that I posted, one thing that she mentioned is that you might, by giving them the ability to choose what happens, may be the most empowering thing they've experienced in a long time. Okay. Saying, I think that, if they've admitted to it, yes, I'm in his basement. He doesn't let me leave. He doesn't go anywhere I want with me. He's like, can I give you help? Right? Can we call somebody? And they say, no, I'm going back home with him. Right? And we've had this before working with the Jonah Project, where the person says, send me back to him. Drop me back off. I want to go back to the person. And they stayed with us for 2 or 3 days. And they want to go back. Okay. I think in that past, the person working with them brought him to like a McDonald's and said, I'm not going to drop you back off the house, but if you want this person to come pick you up at McDonald's, it's fine. Right? Brutal situation, but they are an adult, right? Right? We don't get to you don't get to like make them captive in our way too, even if we were trying to help them. I was doing quotation marks, but that's probably not appropriate. But they have the freedom to do what they want to do, and a lot of times they'll choose to go back, okay, or they'll choose not to get help in that moment. However, here's the key: how do you get somebody out of a situation like that, an abuse situation, a trafficking situation, is with rapport and relationship. Okay, you build rapport with the person. Maybe the next time they do get help with you, maybe they seek you out. Hey, can I talk to that one nurse who was very friendly? Right? Yes, of course you can. And then maybe that time when the rapport is built, the most effective interventions I've had was with clients that have built rapport. And that often is after the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth time I've talked to them. Okay. So it's their decision. Let's see. There's some other stuff talked about. One thing that a student brought up for intervention that was great, pulled it out of the Videbek book, is helping the victim identify strengths. I just love that. And the student who brought it up even mentioned a way where she had somebody write down 10 of her strengths. Fabulous nursing intervention. It's very very specific and is measurable, and you can have the client every day. I want you to think about one of them, or every day I want you to write down one strength or 2 strengths or whatever. And then after a week, then you can ask them, how did you feel? It could be very subjective. The evaluation can be subjective. It doesn't have to be patient did this X amount of times. It could be, how do you feel afterwards? Did you feel empowered, right? If you didn't, then let's figure something else out. That's your evaluation. It could be, give yourself credit for what you guys are doing. Another student brought up 4 threads of commonality within family violence at home, which is like, it's so the home environment is so hard to intervene there. It's such a challenge. And the 4 things she brought up from the Videbek book: number 1, social isolation, right? and I've seen this with in so many cases where the person just cannot leave, right? Where they're behind closed doors, so to speak. The abuse of power and control, again, is that close quartered thing. Alcohol and drug abuse are huge influences there. And then intergenerational transmission. And she even mentioned this statistic: half of women who were raised in a violent environment will tolerate a violent environment, right? That is kind of what they know. This transgenerational abuse is real, right? It's absolutely real. And so I'm glad that you guys brought that up and guys identified that. It's super important. The trying to think of maybe different examples that I have in my own experience, but it comes down, thinking about with human trafficking. And the police officers are don't understand. It's like, how are they trafficked? How are these sex slaves when they go to the grocery store or they go to the convenience store and buy cigarettes and Cheetos, right? And they have money, they can go, they can leave, they can come whenever they want to, and it's not a physical captivity. And this is the same thing with domestic violence, the same thing with an abuse with a child, with an elder abuse, right? This captivity is kind of like a brainwashing thing. It's not necessarily like, sometimes people are chained to a radiator in a basement, right? But it's not always the case. It's not a majority of the case, and it's certainly not the case of people that are calling for help, right? Because they're not able to leave. But if something happens, healthcare tends to be where these people continue to see. They don't necessarily go to the grocery stores. They don't necessarily go to these environments. But if something happens, even if it's if an arm gets broken or something like that, they'll bring them into the hospital, even if it's not right away. And so we can intervene there, and understanding that it's a psychological captivity, right? It's just the grooming process. It's the I'm gonna post a video that I forgot to post earlier on a YouTube. A lady, why did I stay in a domestic violence relationship, right? And it's because it's a grooming process, and because there's a violence cycle, right? The violence cycle of there's building, the tension, is building, and then a violence occurs, and there's kind of a honeymoon period, right? But because we're survivalists, because we as human beings need to survive, when that honeymoon period comes, we allow ourselves to believe that that's the end of it. Not because we're weak, but because we have to survive. So in order for you to psychologically survive it, you allow yourself the belief that okay, now he's different. When he says that terrible line, or it's like, baby, I didn't mean to hurt you, whatever that disgusting, that process is, we allow ourselves to believe that because we have to, right? Not because you're weak, not because you're a victim, because you have to, because psychologically you need the break, right? You need to think that it's not going to happen forever. So you allow yourself to believe it's not going to happen forever. And then as the tension builds, the denial is strong. So it makes it very hard to leave. And here's some huge NCLEX things. These are definitely going to be quiz questions. Spoiler alert, right? When the woman in the domestic violence, or when the victim of the domestic violence situation breaks it off, that is when they are the highest risk to die. Okay, so we need to understand that when we're intervening, right? When we're talking to the client about what options they have to leave, right? Why we don't push it on them, and risks, they need to understand that when they leave, they are the highest risk for homicide. Okay, it's huge, right? If you give them literature, okay, call this number if you ever want something, and the perpetrator finds the literature, they are at higher risk for violence. Does that make sense? So how do you, tell them to put it in a shoe, save it under your phone, under Pizza Hut, right? Some ways that we can help with that, being creative, but knowing that just because the risk is there doesn't mean you don't intervene, but knowing that the risk is there is super important, right? And so those are going to end up on test questions for sure. One thing that I appreciated being brought up during the discussion board was the idea of allegations, right? And with the Me Too movement, there was at one point where all of these, these Harvey Weinsteins and the Bill Cosbys and all these people were being taken down, the Kevin Spaceys, and and there was one guy, I don't know his name, but he worked on the show, Lena Dunham. I'm not getting their name right. I don't know which was on. Was it Girls? Is the name of the show? But he had an allegation against him, and Lena Dunham, I think that's how you pronounce her name, said that he didn't do it. The person who's saying he did it is lying. Right, and she got a lot of flack for that because it was because she was outrightly taking his side and saying with absolute certainty that this other person was making an allegation that was false. Okay, or like the Woody Allen side, where personally, it's where he said something like the statement that Mia Sorvino's daughter made against him sounded like it was Mia Sorvino who had written it, and it was such a messy. I don't know if you've ever written that letter. I don't know if you're able to. If it's going to be triggering, don't read that letter. If you have personal experience like that, don't read it. But it's such a, I don't know how to explain it, but it's such a messy letter in a sense that she starts calling out. This is a couple of years ago. Meryl Streep, she starts calling out all these celebrities and saying, how could you work with Woody Allen when he did this to me? But a lot of a lot of celebrities have come up and said that that's a false allegation. And I think what a lot of people say is this girl who was 2 or 3 at the time, they really believe that she believes it. And that's kind of what I believe too. And so this girl is led to believe that she was abused by Woody Allen at some point. So either we have two things: Woody Allen did that and abused her, or her mom. Oh man, whatever made it real for her, and so she still believes it, right? So she was perpetrated by somebody, and I don't know enough other than what I read in the tabloids to say that I have ultimately opinion on it. Woody Allen movies are definitely hard to sit through anymore, so if he stops making movies because of it, but I still think Annie Hall is good. Who's distraction? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go that way, but the allegations is huge, right? And I remember at one point I remember I was talking to a group of people, and I like to kind of play the devil's advocate, or I like to, even if it's somewhat I believe, I like to hit the hardcore hyperbole because it makes the conversation kind of fun. And they were talking about people who are allegations and how we can't believe all the whatever. And I made this statement that I said that the fact that the victims or people who have experienced abuse are able to come out outweighs the risk for people who are victims of allegations. And even though people's lives can be destroyed by allegations, that the people who are able to come out now, it's worth it. That's the opinion I made. I don't necessarily feel that way necessarily, to an extent, maybe to a small extent. But then later on, somebody very close to me had allegations made against them at their workplace, in a place where I used to work with them. They don't work anymore, and so I was sort of asked to taste my own medicine, in this person probably was going to lose their job because of allegations made against them, to the point where I even felt like I should go defend them, and I even went and I wrote a letter, and I think I even made it a meeting with the supervisor, even though I don't work there anymore, to sort of defend. I think I tried to make a meeting with the CEO, and it didn't work, but to the point where I felt like I could defend them for these allegations that were made against them. And so there's absolutely victims of false allegations whose lives are destroyed, and just as like they're victims of abuse, and you know and just like there's two sides of the black and white, I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive. I don't think just because victims of abuse can now come out and hopefully are more empowered, which they're certainly not, right? Somebody even mentioned on the discussion board, with every one case of abuse, there's several more that are not being identified. So there certainly isn't the case where people are now all of a sudden we're finally free to talk about this. No. Maybe a little bit more, but they don't have to be mutually exclusive. We don't have to ignore one victim over the other, right? Victims of allegations are real victims, just like victims of abuse are real victims. Okay, and a lot of times in my experience, it's messy. Right, it's super messy, right? Talking to a lady who boyfriend hit her, and we're talking about the situation. It's like, yeah, well, I hit him first. So I was like, okay, so it's how do you call a victim on that, right? It was mutual, right? And it's not good, and not that the violence that he enacted on her is not traumatic and not hurtful to her, but it's messy, right? And how do you report that, or what do you do there? Or example, like a person who's making an allegation, with like the Bill Cosby trials, they really focused on the discrepancies on the allegations. Well, it only takes one allegation for this guy to go to jail, and a lot of times these other allegations are, maybe the allegation itself, the current one, isn't particularly relevant, but in the context of all the other issues is important. And so, maybe this allegation is maybe a little bit inaccurate, but the truth is this dude sucks, and this dude's doing all this stuff to hurt people. So conversations that I miss to have in class, it's real, and there's no clean answers, and you guys are so respectful in your guys' own experience, so I super appreciate that. Really want to shout out for that. Good job, you guys. I meant to kind of talk about things in more organized fashion, but that didn't really happen. I decided to just kind of went. But so how do we identify people with abuse? And it's good to have these checklists, which a lot of you guys posted about what are signs of abuse. Sorry, I dropped something. And you kind of go through them, and one or two may not be something. It's kind of like the ACEs scale. One or two may not indicate anything, but you have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, and then maybe start asking more specific questions. Okay. I think that's really what I meant to bring up. I'm trying to think of any other. Oh, I did want to talk a little bit about forensic nursing. What a fabulous thing those gals are doing, and I'd really encourage you guys to get SANE trained if you want to be in the ER. Absolutely, if you want to be in the ER, because it's true in that culture of new nursing. It's kind of a I don't know the word is, what's the initiation sort of a thing, that none of them really feel comfortable with it, so they kind of hand it to the new person, which isn't good because they might make a mistake and it might affect an actual like trial. Okay, so so becoming trained is super important. And forensic nursing is really just any sort of nursing that's involved in the, sort of those criminal proceedings, is whether or not uh, a case is brought to, or an investigative purpose, right? And it's such a great example with at the ER, with when someone has a sexual assault nurses go and they know and they do the steps, so that way all that data is usable in the court proceedings, right? I worked in a forensic unit working with people who were long-term that had committed crimes. I wasn't necessarily a forensic nurse, so I was kind of a floor nurse because I had nothing to do with that investigative process or that legal proceedings. However, the psychiatrists and the psychologists and the social workers were all considered, forensic social workers and forensic psychiatrists because they did the data that they collected and the assessments they collected was then used to make legal decisions, if that makes sense. So that would be the difference there. And then human trafficking, really important to know the definition of what is not able to leave, and one of those is coercion, right? Financial coercion, even like that, right? And if somebody, it's even more difficult when they're foreign, when they're not citizens, because if the threat that they might be deported or that their loved ones at home might be hurt, right? And there is a process where people can be granted, sanctuary if they want to, but they have to participate in the legal case against their perpetrator, which is I don't know if I agree with that at all. And that's something that I know, working with Jonah Project, that they are really pushing that. No, the goal is not to get the police in there to make a statement to make an arrest, right? The goal is for the person's well-being and healthiness. If they're able to then participate in that, that's really powerful for them. But the truth is, these cases don't really, they're not, the person feels, like they're made to be crazy, right? They have to go through it all again in front of other people, and a lot of times these people that are hurting other people get off scot-free. And so why is it worth the time to do it? And I'm saying that trying to be through the perspective of the individual, right? Clearly, there's a reason why you would want to do it, because we want to try to get these people off the streets that are hurting other people. But as a victim, that is not their goal. And if I'm the nurse working with the victim, the goal is not for me to get data for them to put this dude in jail. The dude is for this person to live through this. Okay. Other important things, backtrack a little bit to forensic nursing, is you come in and the woman comes in who's just hurt, and you ask them what happened, and it's really jumbled, and it's like, well, her story keeps changing. Well, it's like she's not going to remember the story till 2 or 3 days later when she's able to actually get it linear in her head. So that's another big piece that I really want you guys to remember. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I know we're going to jump into suicide too, and it seems like these two sections are the ones that people have a hard time with and spend so much time on it too. And so reach out to me if you need to. I'm available for virtual office hours. We can Zoom, we can do whatever. We can phone call, and I can talk you through ideas. I think a big piece is that there's just certain areas of nursing that I'm not going to be able to work in. I think that if I worked in pediatric oncology, I don't necessarily have any personal experience. Like I don't know anybody really who experienced pediatric oncology, other than I know that I probably wouldn't be able to work in the NICU either with the neonates personally, right? That's something that I wouldn't personally. It would not be emotionally safe for me to be there, even though I don't necessarily have that experience. I would be burned out in 2 weeks. It just wouldn't happen, right? And psych is somewhere where I was able to do okay in, right? There's certainly some times where I'm driving home crying. It just happens, right? There's certain things that I know if I'm in a conversation with a client and they bring something up, it's gonna hit me hard, even if it's not something I've experienced. And I start having nightmares and I start crying, and I have to talk to my wife about it. I have to do my coping. But if that happened every day, I couldn't work there. And I think that's the thing is probably in every environment you're going to be faced with some sort of abuse with these clients. There's always a risk there. I can't think of an example as a nurse where you could be completely free of it, but I know there's situations where you can have a lower risk. And as new nurses, I think it's important that your goal as a new nurse when you graduate is to develop your skills and create your niche as a nurse and get yourself going. And it shouldn't be having to fight off all of these emotional triggers and traumas that you've had in the past. And so, not saying that somebody who doesn't have first line experience isn't so useful, and that I've seen it before where somebody has a personal experience that's similar to the patient, they're able to connect with that, and they do things with that patient I couldn't have imagined doing, right? It's not that that's going to be useful for you, but at first I would recommend being in a safer place, and also realizing if you're not in a safe nursing environment, to go to a different one, and that's really an option. So that's kind of where I want to stand. But if you do need to talk to me, I would really encourage, even if you have personal experience, to still do the assignments. I can see how maybe some assignments might be harder than others, or like discussion boards, reading other people's opinions. Maybe they don't have the experience you have, and it might be really hard for that. I can create an alternative assignment if you need it. So just reach out to me, and if anything, we can just talk about it. Okay. You guys all rock. Again, next week, 12:30 or 2, we're going to be watching The Listeners. All right, and watch the video, the other YouTube video about why this young lady in this TED Talk stayed with her abuser. It's a very personal, very real example. All right, have a good day. Bye.